Hi, Misha here, and I've been going back through some older guns just for a change of pace, and I thought this would be a good time to really dive into the M44 Mosin Carbine. And these are mine here. On the top I have a 1944 Soviet Russian. In the middle I have a 1953 Circle 11 Luxnik Radom from Poland, and on the bottom I have another 1953, this one from FEG, which would be Factory 2 in Hungary. You know how much the internet loves Hungarian guns chambered for 7.62 by 54R. And I've had a lot of M44s, a lot of Mosins come through my hands over the years. I thought I would explain why these are the ones I decided to keep, kind of what features they have, what makes them each a little different from the other, and just, generally talk about the last major production model in this very storied firearms lineage with somewhere between 35 and 40 million produced in total. And this was one of the last ones. So with that, let's get into it and go back to the Great Patriotic War. It's commonly held that the M44 is little more than an M38 carbine with a folding bayonet attached. This is and is not true. The M38 up here is kind of unique in and of itself. For whatever reason, the Russians, Imperial and Soviet, were reluctant to really heavily produce the Mosin in carbine form. There was the model 1907, but for the most part, they were the rifles. But in the mid-30s, they decided they really needed something for support troops to be used as more of a defensive gun. Something, a rifle, a carbine, that people who did not primarily use such a thing could have for keeping themselves safe, kind of a PDW. And in 1938, this pattern was hit upon, and really this was just an update of the 1907 carbine, much as the original 1891 infantry rifle had been updated to be the 9130. Now they were going to update this to be the M38. Officially patterned that year, it went into production at Izhevsk in 1939, and it would remain in production there through 1945. Although that was a light production year, that's what actually makes this gun a little unique, is the fact that it is a 45 production. They would also be produced briefly at Tula in 1940 and 1944. And they would build about 3 million. But these would be treated just that, as a carbine. They were issued to artillery crews, communications, other support troops, couriers, that kind of thing. Overall, we're 8.5 inches shorter than the standard 9130. This is about 40 inches tip to tip. It has a 20-inch barrel, and it weighs just a hair over 7.5 pounds. So, not light, but not bad for that day and time. Otherwise, it's your standard Mosin action, box magazine, what have you. This is in a wartime stock with the hollow rear slot, no escutcheon in the front. We just have a simple liner to keep it from breaking through where the wood is relatively thin. Cleaning rod, protected front sight, and notice how close the front sight is to the muzzle, and so no way to attach a bayonet. Also, rear sights adjustable out to 1,000 meters. This actually proved very popular, even though it was in relatively light production compared to the 9130. So by the midpoint of the Great Patriotic War, around 1942, Well, Russia was in a different position. The SVT-40 was less than successful. Meanwhile, the PPSH-41 and the at the time new PPS-42 submachine guns, these were proving quite popular and useful. So in 1943, it was decided to do a test run of carbines with a new pattern of folding bayonet assembly attached. And this would be a full unit with a collar and piece, front, side, base, all of one. And to let this bayonet fit properly, the muzzle was extended just under ½ inch compared to the 38. So this had an overall length of about 40.5 inches and a barrel of about 20.5 inches. But because of the bayonet assembly and also slightly beefier stock, this weighed nearly 9 pounds, sometimes over 9 pounds depending on the exact wood used. Otherwise, it was same gun, truthfully. So yeah, they did a test run at Izhevsk in 1943. They made 50,000. It obviously was successful because it was ordered into full production in 1944 at Izhevsk, also at Tula. And it would be adopted as Russia's first standard issue, general issue, carbine. Before that, it had always been rifles. So this officially replaced the 9130 during the last year and a half of the war. However, not all that many got to the field, but it was still in production. And again, the M38 would continue briefly until 1945. Tula would only make the M44 in 1944, only about 100,000, because then the factory relocated back to its original position before the Germans came. 1944 and 1945 would be the heaviest years of production at Izhevsk. Russia would build about 7,700,000 of these, a little more. And of those, basically 7 million were built in either 1944 or 1945. Production would continue through 1946 and 47 and 48 at Izhevsk, but at extremely reduced numbers. Those years were under 200,000 each, even closer to 100,000 once. So they were making them, but the time was pretty much over because the SKS had been adopted as, well, the SKS Carbine in 1945, and soon the Kalashnikov rifle would be adopted in 1947. So having a Mosin bolt action would kind of be obsolete. Nevertheless, it did prove successful, and a lot of these would be produced. Here we are, flipped over. You can see this pattern of receiver. This is called the high wall, where it's not cut out. This was something done during World War II to save on machining. In fact, with the 9130s, they would even not machine out both sides where the safety's at to save time. Most all of your M44s will be on round receivers, although there are a few odd ones that appeared on hex receivers because they were recycled from other things. Here we are. Here's our bayonet deployed. This housing assembly was designed by Mr. Simon. And the idea was, if you put a bayonet on this, it made it better for hand-to-hand fighting, either urban warfare or a charge in a field. And that was what kind of let the Russians decide that a carbine could be general issue. Yeah, they like their bayonets. So much so that these were actually sighted in at the factory with the bayonet fixed in the deployed position. So, yeah. you may or may not have troubles if you shoot it without. Again, this is a birch hardwood stock with the unlined rear swivel, slot rather, and here's our front slot. This is in a laminate birch stock. You can see the reinforcing pin here for it. These were used late in the war and more over after the war during refurbishment. They were heavier but also stronger, and it let them use lower grade wood. For this, it has the full escutcheon liner in the front and in the back, and typical steel butt plate. So yeah, the M38 was out of production in Russia by 1945, the M44 by 1948, and the M44 would remain in kind of second line service up until the 50s, by which time the SKS would go to second line use, and the M44 would either be put into reserve stockpiles for doomsday, or, as more often happened, given away or sold to Russia's Comm Bloc, Warsaw Pact, and other allies, as well as third world nations they were trying to support revolutions in. So with that, let's compare to the other guns and kind of look at the variations. In Poland, this was known as the WZ-44 carbine, and the reason it didn't get its own Polish name is because it was considered a direct copy of the Soviet. If they had made kind of their own variant, they would have given it a unique name. For example, they did do a version in 22LR as a training rifle, a cadet rifle, and they called it the WZ-48. It's kind of interesting. So this is based on the late post-war Soviet design. The first pattern here, not necessarily considering stocks, which were easily replaced, existed from really the end of 43 through mid to the end of 1945. Also at Tula as well as Yashask, of course. But at the end of 45, they would make several small but noteworthy changes to the design. And the Polish gun here reflects that. These were produced between 1951 and 1955 at Circle 11, the Luxnick Radom factory. And they would continue to refurbish and update them afterwards, too. It was basically a make-work program, but the Polish guns are very well known for really attractive bluing, lots of polishing going on. They had beechwood stocks with a kind of an oil stain finish. Interestingly, it has the unlined rear slot and the simple liner front slot. The rear sight was ever so slightly changed, but nothing really to speak of. The action is the same, the magazine. There is a small change to the receiver that we'll look at when we flip these over. But most of our changes are on the front end here. For one thing, we have a wider, beefier base for the front sight compared to our first pattern. And we have a different bayonet style here. I'm going to set you down so I can show you. This, if you notice, has these teeth in the back for it to lock into, but not in the front. The late style, though, has them in both locations. in the rear here, and in the front here. In addition, this is scalloped with little grasping grooves here, and it's kind of cut back there compared to this version, which is much simpler. No cut back here, and the grasping grooves are definitely kind of less deep and less dished in. And this kind of flares out. So yeah, just that was done so it can kind of lap over the muzzle easier. This one you have to keep pulling on. Obviously this took a little bit more machining to do. This was a little easier, but post-war they had the time. And again, these are mostly make-work guns. Let's flip them over and I'll show you the receiver. And again, this is the high wall, and the late pattern returned to the low wall receiver type here. It's a little lighter, a little more cosmetically attractive. Just something they didn't do during the war, but would go to afterwards. And here's the other side of the Polish. No real surprises. These Polish, again, are known for very high quality. As I'm sure you know, the serial numbers are on the barrel shank, which counts as part of the receiver too, the bolt, the floor plate, and the top of the butt plate, which counts for the stock. Those are the 4 serials on a Mosin, and this one does match. This one is what I would consider a light refurb, because it still has the blued finish. It's not the later style where they went to that kind of black finish. Of course, this one has the very attractive Polish bling. So yeah, they would produce these up to 55, but by 56 they were getting ready to make the AK. They were actually going to make the SKS in Poland, but then they decided they didn't need it, so they jumped straight from the M44, the WZ-44, to the PMK, as they called the AK initially. They had also been producing the PPS-43, and then their own variant known as the PPS-43-52, and they also made some PPSH-41s. So, what about Hungary? So here's our Hungarian example. This is known as the Carbine 48 Minte, the 48M. There was also a rifle 48M, which was 9130. And the history behind how this came to Hungary is interesting in and of itself. You know, Poland did not have an easy time of it. Invaded both by the Nazi Germans and the Soviet Russians, and broken and split apart all throughout World War II. The Russians were certainly the lesser of two evils, perhaps. Maybe, sort of, probably not. Either way, they weren't in a good position. But Hungary had been an ally of the Nazis. So after World War II, they were hit pretty hard. Their military was limited, I think, to like 25,000. The number of small arms they could have was limited. They were scaled back pretty hardcore. And they were, of course, forced to adopt Warsaw Pact, i.e. Russian standards. In the beginning, they were encouraged to buy 9130s and M44s from Russia. And then they were encouraged to buy the production line, which they didn't really seem to want to do, maybe. Nevertheless, they did in 1948, and they would set up at the FEG factory in Budapest, and they would start cranking out rifles, and, well, carbines mostly, the 48M. And from what I've been able to find, they really only built these, at least in any numbers to count, in 1952. And as this one says, 1953. In each of those years, they built about 80,000. And there's maybe a few thousand more early production runs and maybe late refurbs and put-togethers, but those were the two main years. Now, I don't know how many were built in Poland, so if you know, please share. And again, this was a make-work program. In 1955, they would adopt their Kalashnikov variant, and it would go on from there. Now, their M48 or 48M is also based on the late pattern, so it has the wide reinforced base. It has the later style bayonet housing, although there are some minor differences we'll look at when we flip it over. And it has the typical 1,000-meter rear sight. And it too has the low wall lightning cut receiver. One thing that's interesting, the Hungarian factory, FEG, by the way, they use the code 02, they had the Soviet style cut. Poland ever so slightly changed the cut, and I doubt you can see it on camera. You can kind of feel it on the edges where the bolt meets. It's a slightly different way of doing lightning cut. This is more curvy here, if you notice. This comes just more straight down. See? And again, the edges are a little different on top too. Minor thing, but hey, this is kind of the point of the video. And they too used beechwood stocks, although the Polish wood seems a little smoother. The Hungarian wood has a oil finish and a bit of a more grainy texture. It's also been reported in a few places that they also used elm, but I'm skeptical when I read anything about wood because that's one of the things that often gets kind of changed. Like the whole teak wood myth about Zastava Yugoslavian. Either way, this does have full escutcheon in the back and in the front. And I don't know if you can tell on camera too, at least on mine here, there's some kind of visible lathe marks on the chamber, which is actually, I think, kind of neat. Otherwise, it's your typical gun. One thing about the Hungarians, because of where they went and how they were done, it's not terribly easy to find these that are all matching. So if you do find a Hungarian that's matching, you're doing pretty good. And fewer of these were made than the Polish, as far as I know. I could be wrong on that. But certainly fewer than in Russia. Let's flip these over. And here's the other side of our Hungarian friend. In addition to the 02, they have the Hungarian crest. They also usually have a B for Budapest on them. Nicely marked stock. These have a nice blued finish and are pretty good in the finishing department, but they really can't hold a candle to the Polish. And even the very late production Russians can be a little bit nicer, perhaps. So the Hungarians aren't bad, but they definitely show a little more haste. Looking at the front end, as you remember, this has the unscallop here, cuts. Here's our Polish with the scalloped and has a bit of a beveled edge on the inside. It's very smooth, very rounded, so it can snap over very easy. And these grooves are dished in and pretty finely done. But if we look at the Hungarian, we notice a little less care. This is a straight, sharp edge here, 90 degrees. and the grasping areas are just a little coarser. They're deeper, which is good, but yeah, just a little less machining, a little less time went into that, a little bit more haste. Otherwise, pretty much the same. This bayonet likes to flip up a bit. This one fits nice and snug in the cutout. So does this Russian. In fact, this Russian fits the best. The Hungarian too uses the late style collar. Again, just a little bit more machining left on the inside there. But there is one odd difference with the Hungarians, and it's really the reason, aside from just being Hungarian and cool, that I kept this one. If you look at the Russian, look where the spring ends here is compared to the front sling slot. It's in the same basic location for the Polish. It sits a little deeper, but when we look at the Hungarian, we will note they're almost right on top of each other. Very little space between. For some reason, they moved the front back just a bit. Certainly not even an inch, maybe half an inch. But that's something that's pretty distinctive and a good way to tell a Hungarian M44, or rather 48M stock, at a glance, is that front slot is slightly moved back. But other than that, in the kind of version 1 from World War II until just after in Russia, which is only ever built in Russia, and then the version 2 made in late Russia and exported, the M44 changed pretty little. There is another version here where this collar is slightly different than on these, but that gives you an idea. So of course these were not the only nations to make this pattern. Probably the most famous and the one that definitely produced the most, at least outside of Russia, would be China. They did the Type 53, so a little bit late to the game, getting in 1953. And they would mass produce the crap out of these and issue them as front-line weapons until they finally had the SKS, the Type 56, and the AK, the Type 56. So this was going to be China's frontline gun until then. Afterwards, China would transfer them to the militia and second-line units, which would continue to use them in some areas, especially in rural areas, up to the early 80s. China, of course, would also donate many to its allies, for example, Vietnam, and places all around the world. Albania, that's pretty famous because a lot of the Type 53s we have in America came via Albania. Another one is Romania. They produced a late pattern known as the M53. And actually, as far as I know, Romanian production would be the smallest number. No one knows exactly how many they made at the Kruger arsenal, but estimates are about 70,000. They made a small number in 1953, the bulk in 1954, and then 1955 would be the last year in Romania because they would transition to the SKS in 56, and then eventually to the Kalashnikov. Now, interestingly, Romania, while it produced some M44s for its own army and police use, it had an eye towards exporting them to the Third World, Africa, South America, and East Asia. However, because there were so many surplus Russian guns and Chinese guns everywhere, they found that it was not a good commodity, and so production was quite brief. So those were the nations that outright produced the M44. Other nations, like Czechoslovakia and Yugoslavia, would refurbish existing guns, sometimes making stocks or other parts, but basically just using the existing actions. And you'll see Russian, Hungarian, Romanian, Chinese parts. Albania too, again, would have a lot of these and reissue them and reuse them for many years. And the guns are just proliferate throughout the entire world. Many were encountered by U.S. soldiers in Vietnam. Many would turn up in hot spots in Africa. Russian soldiers would go up against M44s in Afghanistan in the 80s. Many would turn up in little guerrilla strongholds throughout South America and Cuba. They just kind of went everywhere. So even though it was kind of obsolete by the time it was even adopted, on the other hand, what made it so attractive was it was extremely simple to operate. I mean, it's a bolt action. Everyone knows how a Mosin looks, but simple bolt action gun, firing a powerful cartridge, but it also was a rimmed cartridge, meaning it was much more forgiving for headspace. A lot of these late production guns, I should say, actually have nice triggers. And of course, it had a simple box magazine, 5 rounds, single stack. And who doesn't like a pig sticker? So, simplicity has its benefits. You could hand this to any conscript or, rebel farmer, any, school teacher turned revolutionary, and they could probably figure out how to make it work. And because of its powerful cartridge, if it actually hit its target, yeah, it's going to do some damage. And of course, the ammunition itself, unlike many other rounds from that time period, was still in production and is still in production today. So getting ammo for it and different types of ammo with that, very easy to do. And with that, why are these the 3 out of the various Mosin nuggets that I've decided to keep? In the early and even mid-90s, the M44 was not terribly common here. We did have some 1891s in their variants, and some 9130s, but the M44 and even the M38, not so much. At that time, we mostly had Mosins out of places like Finland. But of course, with the falling of the Berlin Wall, the disillusionment of the Warsaw Pact, the crumbling of the comm bloc, a lot of nations in Eastern Europe and Russia found that they had lots of guns in storage and not a lot of cash. So the guns really started to flow in. And the first M44s I recall seeing around the turn of the millennium were actually not Russian. They were Romanian, Hungarian, and Polish. And a lot of them were in gorgeous shape. Back then I bought a Romanian, which had really nice, attractive bluing and nice wood stock. And the Romanian and the Hungarian at that time at my local store that I bought surplus from, they were in the $70 to $80 range. They had Polish, but they were $110. And back then I thought, well, the Romanian was nearly as attractive and a good chunk less. I mean, $40 mattered. So I got a Romanian. But then we started to see Russians come in, either out of Russia herself or the Ukraine. And this would have been around maybe 2003, 2004. And of course, a lot of them had had the refurb treatment, but they were cheap, at least in the beginning. $50 to $60 for really nice condition. And, it's funny, back when you could only get the Romanian, the Hungarian, or the Polish, everyone, myself included, wanted the Russian. But then as the Russian M44s really started to flood the market, the others disappeared, and we realized that they were kind of almost a one-shot deal. They seemed common and ubiquitous, but in reality, these were only produced in the hundreds of thousands, whereas the Russians were produced in the millions. Nevertheless, I sold my Romanian and got a Russian. Not this one. In fact, the Russian I had, and I kept it up until just a couple of years ago. It was a typical 1944 Russian refurb with the black paint and the shellacked stock. Perfectly good, straight from the importer, so it had a great bore. Numbers matching. But when this one came in, I really liked it. I liked the fact that it had the laminate stock. And then it still had more or less the original blued finish and bolt setup here. And the fact that it had the early style bayonet assembly, front sight, all that good stuff. Really, though, it was the laminate stock. It also helped that it has the old school import mark. Let me flip it over here just so you can see it on the barrel. Very nondescript. I mean, certainly no mark is the best mark, but if you're going to have it, having it on this collar is good. And it's very small font. So I sold my original and picked this one up, and I feel very, very good about this decision. It's a good, honest Russian M44. And I've had plenty of others come in. I've had some truly unrefurbished ones from, say, 46, 47, even 48. And I remember when you could even get the 1943 ones. They were especially marked off. I looked at them in SOG, and they were a little more money, but not crazy. Again, when these were like 50, you could get a 1943 for, I can't remember, like 70 or 80. A little more, but nothing nuts. So that's why I picked my Russian. But then I thought having some variants would be neat. Ever since seeing those really attractive Polish ones, I thought getting one would be pretty nice. So I kind of told people I was looking for one. And actually the first one I got in here, at least within recent time, came from a friend out in Albuquerque. But then this one came out of another friend's collection 2 years ago when we went to Tennessee. And it's actually a good thing we ended up with 2 of these, because if not, Jay and I might have had an impasse, because we both like Polish guns. But luckily we had 2 of them come in pretty much equal condition, so he got one, I got one, and we didn't have to pay out the nose for them. I mean, they certainly were more, not $110 anymore, but yeah, it was in reasonable money. And this one is a nice example, nice even wood stock, very pretty bluing. And can't remember if this one has an import mark or not. I'm feeling under the barrel. I don't know if this one does, honestly. It came out of a old-timey collector's collection, so he had quite a few non-marked things. If this has one, I might be not feeling it right now, but it's a small one. Certainly not a billboard. A nice bore too on this one, and it's a very slick gun. Very nice trigger. No sticky bolts here. So yeah, I always kind of knew I wanted a Polish. It's kind of an example of a late production and just how nice a Mosin could really be. Now the one I didn't expect to keep was the Hungarian. I've had Yugo reworks, refurbs. I've had more Romanians since my original one come in, and I've had Chinese. Now a lot of the Chinese are in relatively meh condition. I've had 1 or 2 really nice ones, but a lot of them are kind of meh. And while my original Romanian was very attractive with not a whole lot of wear, most I've had since were, I don't want to say rough, but not perfect, and they weren't matching. In fact, a lot of them, for some reason, had Hungarian bolts in them. And the same thing goes for Hungarians. Most of the Hungarian guns I've had in were non-matching and in pretty well-used condition. Now this one's not as smooth as the Polish. The bolts are not gritty, but just a little stiffer. And the trigger, it's got more take-up, but it still actually has a very clean break. This one came out of the same collection as the Polish up there. And when it was a matching example, in nice shape, I just couldn't bring myself to sell it. And it does have a small import mark here, but nothing egregious. And I do like the repositioned sling slot. It's just kind of unique, in the lathe marks in the barrel. It's just a unique look. And again, it's not as rare as a Romanian, but it's certainly rarer than, say, a Chinese. So I thought, what the hey, it gives a good example, and you just don't find nice condition FEG Factory 02 Mosins too often. So I decided to hang on to this one too. And why didn't I keep a Romanian and a Chinese on top of that? Really, at that point, there's not a lot of differences. Yeah, I know markings, but I can't see markings. What I really kind of enjoy are mechanical differences, variant differences, you know, different types of stock, different finishes. Again, things like the sling swivel being relocated, things like the different bayonet housings, and things like the different receiver lightning cuts. That stuff is of primary interest to me. When it comes to markings, yeah, it's just not as important. I understand for a lot of you why it is. I'm not knocking it. I'm just saying in my particular position, it just doesn't be. Plus, if I kept everything, I would be a very poor business person. So, you know, you got to kind of pick your favorite. And that's where I'm at here with these 3 M44s. I'm actually very, very happy with these. And feel quite content. In fact, these have kind of been my 3 Mosins for over 2 years now. Or 3 M44s, rather. And unless something really cool and bizarre and unique and special comes along, this will probably be what I keep. And so that's my reasoning. So what do you think? I'd like to hear your Mosin stories, why you got the ones you have, or maybe a white whale that you finally obtained. I've had some of the 22 Polish trainers as well, and Jay has one of my old ones, and they're actually a lot of fun. So, just thought we would talk Mosins, kind of adding a little more milsurp to the agenda. And it really is just a very historically important rifle. It really is. It's popped up in a lot of places over a lot of time. Anyway, with that, I invite you to comment below. Please do. If you could, like, share, and subscribe. And if you'd like to help support the channel, please check out the link to our Patreon page. This is Misha, and I'll catch you very soon next time.